Stepping into the store was eerie. While every time I went in knowing what to expect, this time the entire store sent off an almost paralyzing sense of fear into me. Olivia, as normal, was just excited to be inside again. She hugged Tempe tightly as the pair went about looking for where Travis's soul might be kept. "Don't wander out of my sight," I told her as she started towards Creel's office. She looked up at me and gave me a strange look. She then looked back at the office and pointed towards it. I raised my brow at her and looked over at the office, then back at her. "What is, darling?" I asked her. "You don't hear the phone ringing, Mommy?" she asked me with a look of absolute confusion on her face. I looked at her and then up over to the office door. I didn't hear anything but the creaking of the old wood and the soft chittering sounds of mice in the walls. I couldn't hear anything that sounded like a telephone ringing. Alright, you go to the office and answer it. Just don't touch anything, dear," I told her. To which she nodded and went to the door, keeping it open and walking inside to answer whatever imaginary phone she thought she heard. I meanwhile went about trying to locate any kind of lead on where Travis's soul might have been being kept. I looked once again behind the counter, on the back wall, and even to the wall of new voodoo dolls. But nothing called to me as being where Travis was being kept. "Olivia, are you done in there?" I asked her, walking over and letting myself into King Creel's office. I looked around the rather messy looking office with a soft calling to tidy it up. But I pushed that down and walked over to Olivia, who was sitting on Creel's chair and talking on a rotary telephone. "What's a math head?" she asked me when she saw I was in the office with her. "This man is calling about some math heads. Does that mean someone who really loves math?" she asked me. I looked at her just as confused as she no doubt was. I took it from her and put it up to my ear. "Who is this?" I asked. On the other end, I heard nothing but a dial tone. Then a hard sigh and the sound of someone shifting in a chair. "You're that limey bitch that Charles keeps complaining about," a tired and annoyed voice of a man told me from the other end. "Where is that idiot with the meth heads he promised me?" he said, his voice becoming one of anger now. "He's indisposed right now. I'll pass it along," I told him, not having the time to talk to whoever this was on the other end. I was about to hang up the call, but suddenly a garbled and sloshing noise came from the other end. "Tell that bastard to give me what he owes me," the voice suddenly said. It came in distorted and almost impossible to hear clearly. I pulled the phone away as it began to ooze the black sludge that normally comes out of Creel when he's damaged. I quickly slammed the phone back on its receiver and backed away from it. "Olivia, don't answer that anymore," I told her quickly. To which she nodded, still confused about the whole process. No doubt still confused as to what a math head was. We quickly switched gears into looking for the bottles with Travis's soul. I was about to give up hope when Olivia suddenly tugged on my sleeve and pointed down at the floor. "Tempe says try right there," she said, hugging the doll into her chest as she looked up at me. I stared at her for a moment before getting on my knee and knocking on the creaky old floorboards. Most of them sounded hollow until I got to a spot right next to Creel's chair which sounded hollow. I quickly dug my nails into the opening spaces between them and pried it open. Staring back at us were the two bottles. The red one was still trying in vain to escape, while the blue one was still idle at the bottom, seemingly never having moved from where it had fallen. I nodded quickly and let the floorboard fall back down into place. Looking at Olivia and Tempe, I offered them both a smile and kissed Olivia on the head. "Good job, sweetie," I said with a loving smile, quickly standing up and heading for the door into the main floor of the shop. And right into Creel, who had certainly seen better days. It looked like he had been hit by a train. His body was ragged and black ooze dripped from cuts all over his body. Quite the spell. But not enough to hold me. He chuckled. It was impossible, the spell still had a few more minutes left in it. I looked over at where we had trapped him and sure enough, the candles were still breathing and the chalk line was still in place. "How did you escape?" I asked him, pushing Olivia behind me and handing her the bottles to hold onto. Creel chuckled, letting out long haggard breaths as he looked at me with his button eyes. His pale face contorting into a scowl as he pushed his mangled body to stand up straight. "Sometimes, brute force is all you need," he chuckled, suddenly going into a coughing fit and hacking up more of the black sludge that kept him and by extension, Travis's body alive. I looked back at the prison spell and then at him. You didn't, I said, finally realizing he had simply thrown himself at it over and over again to simply force his way through it. The equivalent of running into strong glass and being cut by all the shards. Sometimes it's the simplest ways that are also the hardest. He chuckled at me, wiping his mouth and standing up straight as the cuts and bruises began to slowly heal themselves. I must thank you for answering that phone call for me, Olivia dear. Who was it? He asked her as she poked her head out from behind me. Some sad-sounding man asking for math heads. She said quickly, sticking her tongue out at him when she was done. Quickly hiding behind me again and gripping me with her hands as she kept the bottles tucked under her armpits. Creole looked as confused as I was when she said that, but soon he was able to put two and two together and nodded knowingly. Sinclair. He chuckled. Sking as he shook his head. He's going to give me hell for not answering that. Oh well, he can wait. He said, turning around and walking over to the counter. Reaching over it and pulling out his cane as the last of his injuries healed. What are you going to do? I asked, trying to build up a bit of courage that I had. Beat us to death with that. Hopefully, that hadn't given him any ideas. He looked over at me and chuckled. His smile spread up to his red-painted cheeks. Nothing so sweet and simple. He hummed at me, raising the cane at us and slamming it down in front of him. Sending a loud smacking sound across the store. The wood shaking and things falling from the shelf. Olivia whimpered and quickly went to hug me as hard as she could. I put an arm behind me to pat her head, trying to keep strong for her. You see, Creole said after the shaking had stopped. Your little stunt with the undead whore has given me a wonderful idea. Why not just bring back the two people who scare you so much more than I do? He said with a childlike giggle. What do you mean? I asked him. My question soon answered by the floorboards in front of him exploding and two sets of arms clawing their way up from there. I recognized one immediately as the flesh began to return to her rotting corpse. Olivia's old mother Sophie. Her eyeless sockets stared at Olivia and instantly sent her into a screaming fit. The other body was at first unfamiliar to me. Even as more and more skin was added to his body, it was still impossible to remember who this was. That is until his mouth opened and he began screaming at me. Alex, you bloody whore. Leaving me with the fucking brats, eh? He shouted at me as he pulled himself to his feet. My blood ran cold as I backed up and fell down next to Olivia, who was bawling her eyes out as Sophie crawled her way to us. Her body was still trapped between being half human and half doll, and she used her one good arm to crawl her way towards us. Billy, please. I couldn't raise your children. My voice trembled as my ex-husband made his way over to me and grabbed me by the hair. His nails dug into my scalp as he pulled me up. All those horrible memories of being his wife, being forced to bear his children, and the night I managed to escape all came running back to me. Left me to deal with them brats after you took off to this place. He spat at me as he pushed me to the wall behind us near Creole's office door. I trembled as I looked up at his rotting face. Suddenly though Olivia screamed out and I looked to see that Sophie had her hand around her throat. You little spoiled brat. Look what you fucking did to me. She screamed at Olivia while she tried to kick and get the half-human and doll hybrid away from her. The bottles she was holding now on the floor as Creole walked to go pick them back up. Happily chuckling to himself. I looked back at Bill as I thought about all I had gone through to get away from him. Then all I had done to take care of Olivia. She mattered more to me than anything in the world. She's my daughter and I will protect her. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed Bill by the head and slammed his head into the wall next to me. Ah. You'll pay for that, you 2-cent whore. He cried, gabbing his cracking face as I quickly ran to Olivia. Grabbing Sophie by the hair and yanking her away from Olivia. Staring at her sockets as I gritted my teeth at her. Don't touch my daughter. I screamed at her, grabbing a loose floorboard from their initial entrance and striking her on the head with her. Turning quickly and striking Bill with it while he was still dealing with his face. I panted hard as I kicked Sophie away further and quickly picked up Olivia. She was still crying and even hyperventilating, and I tried my best to calm her down. My, how very brave, Creole said with a chuckle. I turned to quickly look at him, my heart sinking as he tossed the blue bottle up and down in his hand. I swallowed as I backed up with Olivia in my arms. Something came to my mind as I realized she was hugging me with both arms. Where was Tempe? My answer came moments later when Creole let out a surprised growl as he was suddenly missing a button eye. I looked at him in shock and surprise when I saw Tempe had managed to climb up onto his hat and had suddenly cut one of the buttons from his eyes out. Looking down to the floor, I quickly put Olivia down and picked up the floorboard piece. Creole looked up at me as I shouted out and caught him upside the head with his. A sickening crack coming from him as the board snapped in half. "Did you really think that would work?" he shouted at me, but his tone changed when I grabbed him by the tie and grabbed his remaining button eye with my fingers and tore it from his face. "Ah, you goddamn whore," he screamed at me as he stumbled backward and twisted his head back and forth rapidly. I quickly picked up the bottle he had dropped when I struck him and grabbed the other red bottle from the floor. "Olivia, let's go, baby," I said to her. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and quickly nodded. Running past her crumbling and rotting mother as she scooped up Tempe from the floor and ran towards me and the exit. I waited until she was safely outside before turning to watch Bill also crumble to dust as Creole stumbled around trying to find his buttons. "Goodbye, Bill," I said, "more for me than for him. I was safe from him forever, and with a daughter who I loved with all my heart." I clutched the bottles and quickly left the store as Creole shouted after me. "Good luck doing anything with those," he screamed at me, his laugh picking up intensity as we ran away from the store. "I can't wait to see what you whip up," he cackled as we finally managed to get out of earshot from him. I took a moment to comfort Olivia by the side of the road as she bawled her eyes out. Even Tempe hugged her leg as we both did our best to calm her down. Arriving back home, I quickly put her to bed with Tempe. Leaving her nightlight on, I went to the kitchen and let out an exhausted sigh as I placed the bottles on the table. The red one was still trying to escape, throwing itself against the sides of the bottle over and over again. I picked up the blue bottle and stared at it with a sigh. Creole was right. What was I meant to do with them now? "You can hand them to me," a shrill voice suddenly told me. I stood up and backed away from the table as I stared at a familiar face. "Le Baron Samedi. I won't let you take them. Not if they count as Creole's tribute to him," I said, clutching the bottle close to my chest. But the Baron simply shook his head and walked past me over to the fridge. I backed away from him, also sliding the red bottle over towards me. "Look, that cockroach's days are numbered. I can see the writing on the walls and I need a way to get back what I've lost in investments," he said, opening up the fridge and letting out an annoyed tsk. "No liquor. What kind of fucking house is this?" He looked over at me with an annoyed look. I stared at him and crossed my arms at him. "I'll give you some," I said, pulling the bottle of booze out from under the table and placing it down in front of him. "If you and I make a deal," I said. He stared at me, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile. He came over and sat down on the other side of the table. "I'm listening, bitch," he said, pulling out a cigar and placing it in his mouth. Eagerly waiting to see what my proposition was. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and laid it all out for him. "I want Travis back. Not as a puppet, but as a human," I told him. And he shook his head back at me. "Can't. He's been dead too long. Same with his family, can't bring them back either. Unless you want them as fucking zombies," he said with a smirk, puffing away at his cigar. I nodded, knowing as much. "But I had heard you ask for the impossible, so you can get what you want. Then take away the murderous tendencies he's gotten. Put his soul back together and let him sleep," I told him. To this, he let out an audible hum, nodding to me as he blew out a perfect smoke ring. "Interesting. Go on, this is seemingly like fun," he said with a smile. "And give him back his eyes. Let him sleep, so this never happens again," I said, sliding the liquor closer to him. A tempting offer for him. He stared at it and licked his lips, seemingly desperate for a drink. "And this is all I get for my hard work?" He pointed at the bottle. Definitely tempted for it, but also trying to contain himself. "There must be more," he told me. "You get Creole. And all those souls he has trapped in the Voodoo store." His eyes lit up at that. He slowly lifted his hand up to the cigar and took it from his mouth, staring at me and chuckling. "Truly an excellent deal," he nodded, reaching out to take the bottle before I reached out and pulled it back over to me. "Not until I have your assurances that he'll stay in hell," I told him. He looked at me suddenly annoyed and backed away from the bottle. He tilted his head back and forth before finally nodding. "Deal." He nodded, to which I finally passed him the bottle. He took it with a smile and bit the end off. guzzling down the liquor with a pleased hum. I nodded with a smile as I stood up and walked off towards Olivia's room, leaving the bottles there for the Baron to work his magic. Walking up to her room, I noticed that the light was out. Entering, and I soon found the reason why. Take another step, and I cut her head off, Creole growled at me in the dark, the nightlight shining brightly soon afterward and revealing that Creole had his hand over Olivia's mouth and a knife across her throat. I gasped and wanted to take a step towards him, but the slight flinch I made towards him caused him to hold the knife closer to her throat. So I complied and stood my ground. "Don't hurt her," I begged. He looked down at her as tears rolled down her throat. And then back at me. He gritted his yellow teeth as he seemingly wrestled with his decision. His mother had always made it a point to him to never harm a child. "Y'all are leaving me no choice." He chuckled, standing up and keeping Olivia against his chest and walking towards me. I backed up away from him and swallowed hard. "If you are playing dirty, I suppose so must I," he declared, pushing the knife closer to her throat. Olivia suddenly squirmed and drove her little foot into his crotch. Creole let out a surprised scream and dropped her suddenly. Olivia ran to me and got behind me. "It's over, Charles," I told him. The Voodoo King looked up at me as he looked around like a caged animal. A soft chuckle coming from his throat as he forced himself up, staring at me with buttons from his suit and looking down at Olivia, who was now clutching Tempe. "Au revoir pour le moment," he said with a smile as he rolled his head around and suddenly collapsed to the floor, falling to his knees and then on his face as we went limp. We both looked at each other, then behind us, when someone cleared their throat. The Baron waved to us as he held up the liquor bottle I had given him, which was now filled to the brim with a black sludge. "It's done, mon, cheery," he said with a nod to me, pointing over to the limp body as it suddenly pushed itself up and looked around, his eyes blinking in confusion and then looking up at us. "Travis," I shouted as I quickly walked over to him and helped him to his knees and hugged him, even Olivia running over and hugging him. Travis really was back. "Hey guys. Been a while, hasn't it? I guess Alexandra has been filling you in on everything while I was gone. And she's the reason I'm here now again. Having my eyes back is certainly weird. Blinking feels so weird, and being able to fall asleep for the first time in God knows how long felt amazing. Even if it was only for 2 hours. While the rest of my body is still pale and the scar is still across my throat, I've slowly been going back to a real sense of normalcy. Being able to actually eat, see, cry, everything I've missed feels simply amazing. Day-to-day life with Alexandra and Olivia is going along well, while Alexandra still keeps an eye on me. I wouldn't blame her, after all, I did try to murder her and was possessed. And in other pretty good news, I applied to college. I figured I might as well do it, since I would much rather suffer through any kind of bullshit class than go back to the workforce. My current experience with it has certainly scarred me. I'm sure some of you are wondering how the hell I'll be able to do that looking the way I do. Well, makeup exists for a reason, right? And maybe even online classes. Either way, I'm never going back to the Voodoo store for as long as I live. I've learned my lesson. I have a pretty good life here with Alexandra and Olivia. I pick Olivia up from school, and she shows me off to her friends when they don't believe her brother had his head cut off and lived. Brother. Definitely a weird thing to hear from a 20-year-old single child. But she definitely feels like my little sister now. There really isn't too much left to tell you guys. Other than the occasional nightmare, I don't really like to think of all King Creoles. I have the scars to show what I've gone through, and I would never go back there. I guess this is the end of this. Unless something horrible ends up happening. From Travis, I worked at the half-priced Voodoo store. Au revoir mon chéri. The end. If you like this series so far, subscribe.